If stories like this move you, make sure to hit subscribe before you dive in. You won't want to miss what happens next. Chapter 1. The Whispers in the Hallway. Emily Carter had been a nurse at Riverside Trauma Center for exactly 6 weeks, and in that time she had learned 2 things with absolute certainty. The first was that trauma medicine moved faster than thought itself, a blur of monitors screaming and hands moving on instinct. The second was that the long, pale scars running from her wrists to her forearms made people stare, whisper, and sometimes simply stop talking altogether when she walked into a room. She had gotten used to pulling her sleeves down before shifts, though the scrubs never fully hid them. She had gotten used to the sideways glances in the break room, the way conversations dipped into silence when she reached for the coffee pot. What she had not gotten used to was the cruelty. It started small. Comment here, a snicker there. Then, 3 days into her second month, she overheard 2 senior nurses in the supply closet, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch every word. "I heard she tried to hurt herself in nursing school," one of them said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Makes you wonder if she should even be handling patients. What if she snaps under pressure?" The other nurse laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Maybe she likes matching her patients' scars to her own. Some kind of bonding exercise." Emily stood frozen on the other side of the door, her hand halfway to the handle, her chest tightening with a familiar, suffocating shame. She did not go in. She turned and walked away, her sneakers silent on the tile floor, and found an empty stairwell where she allowed herself exactly 90 seconds to breathe before she had to be back on the floor. The truth about her scars was something Emily had shared with exactly one person at Riverside. Her supervisor, Dr. Alan Whitfield, during her hiring interview, because hospital policy required disclosure of certain medical histories relevant to occupational risk. She had told him quietly, professionally, without drama, and he had nodded, thanked her for her honesty, and never brought it up again. He had not shared it with anyone else. So the rest of the staff filled in the blanks themselves, and the story they invented was always uglier and smaller than the truth. They pictured a fragile woman, a liability, someone who had cracked once and might crack again. What they did not picture, because they had never asked, was 3 deployments to combat zones as a Navy combat medic. They did not picture the desert outside Kandahar, the sound of rotor blades, or the young corporal named Jason Reyes bleeding out in the back of a Black Hawk while Emily pressed both hands against a wound that refused to close. They did not picture the improvised explosive device that had torn through their forward position 18 months earlier, the shrapnel that had shredded her forearms as she shielded a wounded Marine with her own body, or the 11 hours of surgery that followed, or the year of physical therapy that taught her to hold a scalpel again with hands that shook. Emily had left the military 2 years ago, quietly, the way most veterans do, carrying a Bronze Star with a Combat V device in a drawer she rarely opened, and a set of scars she could not put in a drawer at all. She had chosen trauma nursing because it was the only work that still felt like it mattered, the only rhythm that matched the one still beating inside her chest. She had chosen Riverside because it was far from anywhere she had served, far from anyone who might recognize her, because she wanted, more than anything, to simply be a nurse. Not a hero, not a story, not a curiosity, just a nurse. But being just a nurse meant absorbing the quiet cruelty of people who had decided who she was without ever asking. The whispers grew louder over the following weeks. A senior nurse named Patricia began routinely excluding her from the rotation for high-acuity patients, muttering something about liability to anyone who would listen. A resident physician made a joke in front of a patient's family about how Emily probably had personal experience with trauma wounds, and the family had laughed uncomfortably, unsure what to make of it. Emily said nothing. She had learned long ago that explaining herself to people who had already decided not to believe her was a losing battle. So instead she worked. She worked harder than anyone on the floor, stayed later, double-checked every chart, memorized every protocol until she could recite them in her sleep, because if she could not change what people thought of her, she could at least make sure her work spoke a language even the cruelest whisperer could not argue with. Then came the Tuesday morning that would change everything. Riverside Trauma Center received an emergency alert at 6:47 a.m. A multi-casualty incident, military transport, ETA 11 minutes. The details were sparse, filtered through layers of protocol, but the words combat injuries and priority 1 sent the entire trauma bay into motion. Dr. Whitfield assembled his team fast, barking assignments, and when he reached Emily's name he paused only long enough to say, "Carter, you're with me on the lead patient. I need someone who can move." Patricia, standing nearby, opened her mouth as if to object, then thought better of it and said nothing. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 6:58 a.m., and the first thing Emily heard was not the sirens but the low, unmistakable rhythm of military boots hitting pavement in formation, for men in desert-worn fatigues moving with the tight, coiled discipline that only years of training could produce. They were carrying a fifth man on a stretcher, a soldier whose uniform was soaked through, whose face was gray with blood loss, and as the stretcher crossed the threshold into the trauma bay, Emily's entire body went cold with recognition. She knew that face. Older now, a beard where there had been none, deep lines carved by years she had not witnessed, but unmistakably, impossibly, the face of Jason Reyes, the corporal she had kept alive in the back of a Black Hawk 18 months before the IED that had shredded her own arms. The team surrounding him were his unit. And leading them, walking half a step ahead with the unmistakable bearing of a man who had spent a lifetime giving and receiving orders, was a broad-shouldered Navy SEAL commander, whose eyes swept the trauma bay once, searching, before locking onto Emily's face with an expression of stunned, dawning recognition that silenced the entire room before a single word was spoken. For 3 full seconds nobody in the trauma bay moved. Emily's hands were already reaching for gloves, her training taking over before her mind had finished processing what her eyes were telling her. But the SEAL commander's gaze held her in place like a physical weight. "Doc," he said, his voice rough with disbelief, using a word that had not been spoken to her in 2 years, a word that belonged to a version of herself that Riverside Trauma Center had never met. "Emily Carter. It's really you." Dr. Whitfield, mid-stride toward the stretcher, stopped and turned, his brow furrowed in confusion, while Patricia and 2 other nurses standing near the supply cart froze mid-motion, their expressions shifting from professional urgency to bewildered curiosity. There was no time for reunions, and Emily knew it better than anyone in the room. "Talk to me," she said, her voice snapping into the clipped, controlled cadence of a combat medic assessing a casualty, and just like that the moment fractured into motion again. The commander, whose name patch read Hendricks, rattled off the details with military precision. IED strike during a joint training exercise gone wrong. Shrapnel wound to the abdomen, unstable blood pressure, 40 minutes since injury. Emily's hands moved across Jason Reyes's body with a speed and certainty that made Dr. Whitfield stepped back half a pace to give her room, cutting away fabric, pressing gauze, calling out vitals in a voice that left no doubt about who was, in that moment, in command of the situation. "I need O-2 units now," she said, and a nurse who 30 seconds earlier would not have made eye contact with her sprinted to comply without hesitation. The next several minutes blurred into the controlled chaos that trauma medicine demands, and Emily worked with a focus that seemed to erase everything else in the room. The whispers, the stares, the 2 years of civilian life that had tried to convince her she was only a rookie nurse. Muscle memory carried her hands to a pressure point Jason's own team had missed in the field, and when Dr. Whitfield moved to take over the primary assessment, she gave him a rapid, precise handoff report that made the older physician's eyebrows rise in something close to respect. Jason Reyes stabilized enough for transport to surgery within 11 minutes of arrival, a timeline that the attending trauma surgeon would later call, in Emily's official commendation file, the difference between life and a very different outcome. It was only after the surgical team wheeled Jason away, after the immediate crisis had passed into the controlled aftermath of restocking supplies and updating charts, that the trauma bay fell into a silence thick enough to touch. Commander Hendricks had not moved from where he stood near the doorway, and now he crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps until he was standing directly in front of Emily, who suddenly felt every eye in the department fixed on her. "You don't know what you did for us that day in the Black Hawk," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "Reyes has 3 kids now. 3. Because you wouldn't let go of him for 11 hours, because you took shrapnel meant for the man behind you and kept working anyway." He glanced down at her forearms, at the scars that had been the subject of whispered cruelty for 6 long weeks, and something in his expression hardened with a kind of fierce, protective pride. "These aren't something to explain away, document. These are a map of every life you refused to let end. Then Commander Hendricks did something that no one in that trauma bay would ever forget. He stepped back, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a slow, formal salute, the kind reserved for commanding officers and fallen heroes, the kind that demands silence and stillness from everyone who witnesses it. Behind him, without a word of instruction, the 3 other soldiers who had carried Jason Reyes through the doors did the same, their hands snapping to their brows in perfect unison, a wall of camouflage and quiet reverence aimed entirely at a woman in blue scrubs whom half the room had, until that very morning, dismissed as fragile. Emily felt her throat tighten, felt 2 years of carefully guarded composure threaten to crack, but she straightened her spine the way she had been trained to, the way that felt, in that moment, more like coming home than anything had in a long, long time. Patricia stood frozen near the supply cart, her earlier words in the closet suddenly a physical weight in her chest, visible in the way her face had drained of color. Dr. Whitfield, who had known the truth all along and kept it locked away out of respect for Emily's privacy, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he watched the rest of his staff finally understand what he had known since the day he hired her. Nobody said a word for a long moment, the salute hanging in the air like something sacred, until Commander Hendricks finally lowered his hand and extended it instead for a firm, grateful handshake. "Thank you for everything you did back then," he said. "And for what you just did for one of my men today." The story of what happened that Tuesday morning spread through Riverside Trauma Center faster than any piece of hospital gossip ever had, but this time the whispers carried a different weight entirely. Within days, Emily was fielding careful, almost apologetic questions from the same nurses who had once excluded her from high-acuity rotations, and Patricia, to her credit, sought Emily out privately to offer an apology that was awkward but sincere. Emily accepted it with the same quiet grace she had carried through 6 weeks of whispered cruelty, because she understood something that the rest of the department was only beginning to learn. That scars, whether visible on skin or hidden beneath a uniform, were never a measure of weakness, but a record of every moment someone had chosen to stay and fight rather than run. 6 months later, when Riverside Trauma Center opened its new Veterans Outreach program, there was no question about who would lead it, and Emily Carter, once whispered about in supply closets, walked into that role with her sleeves rolled up and her scars in full view. No longer something to hide, but something to be proud of. If this story reminded you that the people who judge us fastest often know us least, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever misjudged someone before learning their real story?